So today we're doing things a little differently. I don't think we've done a 12 o'clock show as of yet. Do you think,
We're
Frida?
we're we're experimenting with everything, and just like experiments, now my ring light is off. But never mind, it's
Well,
daytime. You can see me.
exactly. But the great thing about Causeway Conversations is every month we decide to do a different topic, whether it be our topic today, which is World Food Day, or
Mm.
any other things that are trying to progress the UN Sustainable Goals. So
So yeah,
yeah,
so yesterday countries around the globe marked World Food Day to promote awareness of hunger and action for the future of food, people, and the planet. And the day serves as an opportunity to advocate for a stronger dedication to achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 2, zero hunger.
absolutely. But with climate changing, many countries are seeing more droughts, floods, and wildfires, which has a knock-on impact on food production. And to protect against food security concerns, Singapore has invested around $317 million to drive innovation in the plant and cell-based protein sector. Well, joining us to
Uh
share
huh.
more about this is Jolene Lum, and she is head of business development at Nurasa. Thank you so much for joining us, Jolene.
My
Welcome,
pleasure. Nice to
Jolene.
have you guys. Thank you.
Right. Interesting what they're doing. And so, Jolene, you're at the forefront of Asia Pacific's innovative food scene, having been the founder and CEO of Urban Tiller, which is a direct consumer farm to table agribusiness. And you're currently at Nurasa, which is on a mission to accelerate the
hmm
commercialization of sustainable foods in the region. Tell us a little bit about your journey into agri food.
Yeah, no. So I don't come from an agri-food background. Very few people do in Singapore. My interest really started during COVID
Yes.
when I was running a series of online hackathons called 30 by 30 in our next generation. And back then, the opportunity really came when a lot of summer internships were cancelled in the year of 2020. And we looked around ourselves and we wanted to give opportunities to companies to interact with students, mid-career professionals, to talk about topics that were less common and prevalent that we would talk about in school. And
Right.
we started reaching out to everyone in the agri-food industry to talk about this idea of 30 by 30, which was really announced by the Singapore government back in 2019 when the Singapore Food Agency was formed from previously the AVA. And they really wanted to achieve, for those who are here, 30% of local food production in Singapore by the year 2030. So that's really the starting point of that conversation. We ran a series of programs. We wanted students to understand stakeholder engagement, I think systemic relationships that shape the
Right.
food system the way we know it.
Right.
From there, I really developed an interest, understanding the challenges and opportunities in the agri-food industry, given the challenges that we face with climate change, with ideas of sustainability, and of course, nutritional security. And
Right.
from there, I went on to my startup life for real, trying to raise venture funding for a couple of startups, working on the ground and really building up
Right.
several
Yeah.
ventures that eventually experience. I think,
Right.
yeah, that was my journey into it.
And before Rianne gets into the next question, it's so interesting, right? 2019 Singapore announced this, and then this was really tested with the pandemic. We saw the issues ahead when the pandemic hit. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And oh, sorry, do go ahead.
No, no, no. I was just saying, I think everyone started to grapple with it. We started to see how food systems were working or not,
Not
the risk points, and it was a real test, I think, for companies that had very established business models, which still do, but people were starting to look to the startup space to think about what would disruption look like.
right.
Absolutely. And that's the interesting thing, I guess, what you're doing now, especially with Nurasa, which is a wholly owned company of Temasek, and they support aspiring food tech companies at every stage of the growth cycle. So I'm guessing you've seen a lot, they've seen a lot, coming in since 2019. But I mean, what is the most testing stage for a food startup, and how are you
Mhm.
aiding them with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when Temasek set up Nurasa, previously known as Asia Sustainable Foods, the mandate was actually to accelerate the commercialization and adoption of sustainable foods across Asia Pacific. And I emphasize the acceleration part because between the years 2019, the first lab-grown burger was made by Dr. Mark Post in
Yes.
2013, which was 10 years, 11 years ago.
Right.
But the proliferation and mushrooming of startups really came, I think, the years of COVID and one or two before that. So there were a lot of startups that were doing early stage R&D. There were companies who were innovating, coming up with first products and prototypes. The Impossible Burger came to Singapore not too long ago, actually. It feels like
Yeah.
it's been around for a long time.
Yeah.
But the consumer has an awareness. We've tasted the Impossible Burger, but the industry
Right.
is really quite nascent in terms of becoming a mainstream or widely adopted product. So I think the largest challenge remains to be commercialization and effective consumer adoption. And that's why Nurasa was established as well.
So commercialization and adoption right now, and how difficult is it for players to produce food that is ethically and sustainably sourced, as well as affordable, accessible, and nutritious? Like, how do you find that sweet spot?
Yeah, there are lots of ways to approach that question, right? Because in Singapore, we import more than 90% of our food. So a lot of the Singapore food story, as the Singapore Food Agency and the government would call it, is focused on the local production of leafy greens, for example, the local productions of egg and fish, which are infrastructure that we have. But a lot of our dinner table is actually made up of food that we can't grow here.
Right.
So sourcing still happens at a level of importing, buying from others, especially meat. So in the industry that Nurasa is working in now with plant-based, animal-free products as well, it's a very nascent industry. So a lot of the work that Nurasa has seen and the ecosystem partners have done involve creating manufacturing capabilities in Singapore,
Right. Right.
which then bolster the ability to create and manufacture food locally. There are a lot of different questions you can ask about. Well, you can manufacture the food product here, but we don't have an agricultural hinterland. So a lot of these ingredients still come from other countries. We still
Right.
import the raw materials,
Right.
which is why there's also the promise of cultivated meat, where you then can create meat from cells and grow them in a lab without the need for agri land, basically.
Mm, mm,
But these are all innovations and technologies that are at different stages of maturity. Sort of agriculture space for a little bit as well. We see that the promise of indoor controlled environment farming, it's a big part of that strategy as well. It's not always easy because the technology might not be as efficient, it might not be as cost efficient compared to the food that we can import from other places. So as we know, it's a very different culture as compared to you being in, let's say, Australia or in Europe, where
mm.
you can go to a farmer's market and you
Right.
know where that food came from. It was grown in this farm 40 kilometers out, and you know the farmer who grew it. There is
Yeah.
actually a lot of opaqueness to the food that we get in Singapore, but increasingly in cities, in increasingly urban cities, people are disconnected from where their food comes from. And food companies control a lot of what we eat and what's even available for us to choose at the supermarket or at the store. So very big question. And there is always that question of, okay, do we know where this comes from? You have a
Mm.
list of ingredients on,
Right.
any snack, any sandwich. It's quite difficult for us to actually know whether it was ethically sourced, who gets to who gets to check if it's ethically sourced. That's also a very different conversation.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, obviously we're live, and if you do have any questions for Jolene, do feel free to write them in the chat. And I really would like to talk a bit more about, Nurasa and how you aid all of these different companies. So do you have any success stories that you can share with us? Because there are obviously a lot of challenges, but we would love to hear about the positive, side of things as well.
Yeah, I think I'll give you a couple of anecdotes. Nurasa is also a very new company. So I joined the founder managed team team back in the end of 2021. So we're only a little bit shy of 2 years old as a company. And so far, what we've done is to think about building enabling infrastructure for companies to be able to use instead of startups having to raise funding to heavily invest in capital infrastructure and capex, basically to buy equipment, to set up labs. One of the projects that I was involved in over the last 2 years is building up the Food Tech Innovation Center. So this is a 4,000 square meter facility in the basement of Biopolis. And what we have here is really shared services and facilities. We have a beautiful kitchen. We have become a food grade facility, which is really important for startups because you can do a lot of R&D in a lab, which you can find in some shared labs in Singapore. But being food grade really drives and accelerates commercialization because once you produce the product and you get your processes checked, you can actually sell the product from this location. A lot of my work involves bringing companies here to see if the facilities will be suitable for them to scale up to their next stage of production. One of the companies that I work with is actually a local startup called Prefer, run by two gentlemen, DJ and Jake. They are working on using food side streams to make bean-free coffee. So
Right.
coffee,
Oh.
yeah, bean free is one of these crops. Coffee beans are one of these crops that are increasingly inconsistent due to climate change. So you
Right.
don't enjoy the same level of consistency or quality because of changing climates, and you have issues on farms and how farmers respond. But instead, if you're able to create coffee flavors and the experience of coffee, it really benefits many things, right? You benefit upcycling waste, but you also create a source of coffee that is consistent and hopefully cheaper, and is something that could be really widely accessible because it's such a well-known product. You're not telling
Right.
someone to add anything to their diet, you're just replacing
Right.
and giving them a better substitute. How we help Prefer is so last year, over the last 8 months, we were running a startup challenge where we made an open call for applications. Prefer applied and became a finalist. We had provided a 4-month make phase, like a bit like a hackathon. We gave them access to facilities, access to also our partner, A-Star, the National Research Agency, to run some trials. And now they've actually decided to move into my facility for their next step of development. So
Right.
now they are actually scaling up the production and R&D of their bean-free coffee solution right here. I think if I can speak for them, what they appreciate as well is the speed in which I had given them access to a space to do the work they need to do. Otherwise, time is really of the essence for a lot of startups to test and iterate their ideas, and having to look for a suitable space, renovate, look
Yeah.
for a contractor to do that, become food grade, understand all the requirements to become food grade. That's a different set of challenges. So we were able to expedite that for them. Also used our space to really conduct a lot of customer trials. So we always see customers invited to do coffee tastings every other day. So I get to taste a bean-free cup of coffee every other day.
Right.
And I think that's really important in a startup's journey to really be able to focus on the company that you're building, your product, and really the tech that will hopefully be disruptive.
Right, and anyway, coffee. A lot of people are emotionally connected to that product, right?
Yes.
The World Food Day,
Yeah.
with the climate changing, many countries are seeing also more droughts, as you were mentioning, floods,
Mhm.
wildfires, right, which has a knock-on impact on food production. So you shared a little bit about what are some, and I think that's a great story. Anything else apart from that, the innovation you're seeing in advancing food production, other than this, any other areas?
For sure. I think you bring up, the droughts and the climate change, which are big conversations for agricultural producers who work with the land and on the land. There's an increasing concern that, in the world, we don't produce insufficient amounts of food, but we produce the foods that we eat somehow inefficiently.
Right.
For example, we think about having land that is affected by climate change to produce food like soy, like pea, and a large amount of these ingredients, like soy and pea especially, are actually turned into feed for animals, right? They're perfectly fine to eat for humans, but we actually turn them into feedstock to feed animals before they get turned into food for humans. And in the food industry, we like to talk about the feed conversion. So, for example, it might take more than 30 kilograms of soy to feed a cow to get them to a mature stage for us to eat a steak, versus 30 kilograms of soy being 30 kilograms of food for human beings, right? So it's about levels of nutrition, and of course what we're putting into our bodies. The asymmetry in that causes the fact that, well, climate change is going to severely impact entire value chains and nutrition chains. And that's actually where a lot more innovation now, I would speak about, meat is one aspect, and it's a big aspect. In the alternative protein space, it's how do you make a plant-based product extremely appetizing and exciting to a consumer. Of course, it reduces emissions. Now we're tackling, I think, with the second generation of issues is eating plant-based, and there are a lot of studies to show this. Plant-based is a lot more sustainable than eating meat because the footprint, the carbon emissions are just lower. A lot of the innovations I see in this space, however, include, so I have another, company that I work with. They work in designer fats and oils. So they use precision fermentation to create animal fat flavors that you can add to plant-based products for them to taste a lot better. So that's also really important because that drives consumer adoption. If the consumer decides that a soy-based food product is not good enough because taste and texture is not great, then all the enabling factors around food, like flavoring, texturization, they're also really important in driving adoption. So these are what I call technological enablers to make these food products that are already proven to be more sustainable, even more appetizing for consumers. But then that comes with a second conversation of now we're at the stage of scaling up these technologies and making sure that they are also more sustainable. Otherwise, you sort of undo the work that you've done beforehand. And one of the ways of thinking about that is how do we scale up manufacturing effectively and ensure that technologically it's sure and you can actually drive good yields and still create good food for people, right?
And just on the back of that, actually, because obviously with Singapore, we're so challenged by space and land. So how can, startups that want to expand and want to grow, how do they scale up here?
Yeah, so at Nurasa, one of the things that we've done is, aside from the innovation center that we've built, we have pilot scale facilities here. And after pilot scale, you need to scale up to a much bigger commercial scale facility. We actually have two more food manufacturing facilities in Tuas, where land is a little bit more dedicated to manufacturing. And a big conversation that's going on in the food industry is that a lot of food requires the same processes. Can we efficiently be a contract manufacturer? So instead of every company building their own facility, we have a facility that has invested in expensive equipment and a team that can help different companies scale up their products. So in effect, you can have multiple companies using the same facility to scale up instead of really taking up more and more land. So I think because the industry is very new, it's very helpful that there are services like that several companies can come to use and really be efficient on utilization.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about consumer behavior, right? How rapidly are consumers, Singapore, right, adopting sustainable eating, and has the novelty of new products worn off, meat and also has it, or people still love that?
Yeah, I like to use the analogy of the iPhone for this, right? So at first, the iPhone was a novelty, but the novelty never wore off. It never wore off, right? So I think what a consumer is looking for is something that they can keep in their lives and they will continue using and enjoying. You're very right to point out that there was novelty in all of these foods, and I personally think that a lot of the novelty has worn off. And novelty wears off when someone's not satisfied with the product. Not because it's a fundamentally bad idea, I was excited to have a Motorola at once, but the Motorola didn't live up to expectations, right?
Same like
now
the
you find
BlackBerry and all these things as well.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think innovations are like this, only that food is a lot more personal, a lot more emotional, a lot more nostalgic as a product in our lives. And the truth is, you can have multiple phones and change that every year, but you don't change the way you eat overnight. You don't.
Right.
You crave certain things. Food is tied to memories, is tied to culture. And the interesting thing is that most people who have a regular lifestyle, their calorie intake is flat. You don't add things to your diet, you switch things out.
Right.
And with food, that behavior is difficult because why would you switch to something that is an alternative, right? If you choose to eat, junk food or fast food in a day, you switch out a meal for it, right? And you do that consciously. But is plant-based food or sustainable foods attractive enough? Is it an indulgence in that sense for people to want to switch? I think that's the key question. Aside from just being an indulgence, I fundamentally believe that consumers need to know that what they're eating is better for them. Because at the end of the day, there's always sins and indulgences that we engage in, when we eat. So for me, I would love a plant-based product that is more nutritious for me. If I exercise and work out a lot, I would like something that extremely high in protein and low in fat. And these are not conversations we've had as an industry until very recently, because a lot of the times we were thinking about how do we meat, but at the cost of what you're actually putting into the nutrition of these products, right? And you'll remember the period of time where people were looking at the ingredient lists of the Impossible Burger, saying that, this is sustainable, it's soy-based, but it's as a plant-based product, it's not better for me. In fact, I'm adding more chemicals inside my body. Versus the last 2 years or 3 years, I see more companies in the space saying that this is truly better for you because it's zero cholesterol, it is very low in fat, and now the conversation is how do we functionalize these food products, be it for child nutrition, elderly nutrition, protein content, or even fortified products with vitamins and supplements that you might need. So I think it's really thinking about the consumer is not silly. Always assume an intelligent consumer. They will reach for something that's good for them and is better for them, ideally cheaper than meat. But you can't expect them just to act on the impulse of sustainability. No one pays for that. No one pays for sustainability, and it needs to taste good.
Yes,
right?
yes,
That's the baseline.
we need
that is
it needs to taste good.
Yeah, I guess that's the interesting thing about how you said with the second generation of issues, to encourage more adoption, because you said it's become a little bit nascent now. You shared about how another company you're working with is creating, it's not animal fats, but sort of the fats that make things plant-based taste a bit better.
Fat is flavor.
Fat is flavor. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that we just kind of, we know is bad for us, but it just tastes so good. But what are the other areas to, that are being addressed to encourage increased uptake? Because maybe we could even talk a little bit about how, cell-based, Singapore was very forward-thinking in cell-based meats and things like that. And, we're seeing restaurants in Singapore now adopting, insects and all of these great things which are innovative. But I'm, wondering whether consumers are they on board with that just yet?
Yeah, I think there are several factors to this. The primary one being cost. The government can put out certain messages, and it's great that they're encouraged through different channels. But this is a free market. Consumers make their decisions with their wallet. If something is still too expensive, you're going to face problems up the chain, right? We can encourage, and then all of a sudden the retailers and the distributors tell me, people are just not buying, not at this price point, not at this quality. Restaurants are a little bit more free play, right? Because you can say that this is a premium experience, and you can say that this is the first group of early adopters you want to reach, and it creates that FOMO effect where people go like, oh, have you tasted cultivated meat before? You haven't, right? But you can go to this really interesting restaurant to try it. But at some point, I think the key to commercialization and adoption is also realizing that this can't be a occasional treat. We're talking about conversion at a much bigger scale, and how realistic is it for people to expect consumers to eat plant products or even any kind of animal-free sustainable product in a day, right? Then you drill into, so I've actually done, Nurasa had done a study earlier on to actually do a survey of consumers as to at what occasions do they find themselves eating meat, assuming that they don't engage with plant-based or any of this at all. In an Asian diet, I mean, it's not very much actually, compared to, let's say, a lifestyle where you have eggs and American breakfast for breakfast, you have a steak for dinner, and a huge sandwich with cold cuts for lunch. In Asia, we don't eat like that. In the morning, you realize that we don't. I mean, the occasions in which you eat meat at breakfast was my McDonald's McMuffin this morning, right? That's an indulgence versus maybe a slice of bread at home, a bun, or even soy milk. Lunch could be very simple, and I think that's thinking about at a ground level, how do 80 to 90% of people eat on a day-to-day basis? Then that translates into the occasions where you even have the opportunity to suggest substitution, right? And if that's already limited, then you need to find other ways to include this in the diet, and potentially identify other places in their diet that you can make more sustainable. And the solution might not be plant-based meat, or it might not be animal-free products that are replicas at all. It could be a completely different approach to thinking about rice, a completely different approach to thinking about bread, right? And these are the staples that truly are staples to us. And this is something I care about quite a little bit, because in Asia, working in Asia, a lot of my business partners are European American, and there's a certain idea of what food is. It's going to take a bit more time for us to drill into the Asian palate and the Asian phenotype even, to see how these products impact our health, our appetite, and lifestyle.
Right. I want to bring up food waste, right? And that is that accounts in for Singapore 12% of total waste. Like, it's much higher in Malaysia. Now, how does a change in attitude, adoption of upcycling of food from byproducts need to be undertaken? For people to make or to realize how important an issue this is.
It's not easy, because there are several solutions for food waste and side stream upcycling at different technology levels, right? So one of the things I was doing in the past is using food waste to feed insects, and insects could then either become more sustainable animal feed, or human food, if you're willing to get over the egg factor of eating insects. So that's one way, and that's established. Companies have raised money, people are in business. There are newer technologies of side stream upcycling which involve other technologies like fermentation. They include enzymatic treatment, or sort of transformation of the materials into things like materials for building, for plastic replacement. And these are actually less developed. They are more nascent. And it's actually difficult to deal with food waste, because we see food waste as a statistic, right? 12% food waste. But on the ground, when you work with food waste, it's very different from any other manufacturing process. When I was running the insect business, for example, we had to pay a full-time person to sort waste. You had to pay someone to ensure that the waste was not contaminated. You had to prevent other people from throwing other things that you didn't want into the food waste that you were going to use. So you have a huge supply chain problem in ensuring consistency, quality, and logistics. So I find food waste a super fascinating topic, because when I was working in that business, it was like, why would you pay to move food waste, right? You can pay for deliveries of things, but you should manage food waste in a decentralized fashion, because then you deal with the waste at the source of the waste, and then increase of that waste, and then ship the final product. Ideal, right? But that's an extremely idealistic picture, because how many of you can actually afford decentralized production? That involves, training up people, decentralizing technologies. It's a challenging business model. It's very interesting. How do you collect? How do you ensure consistency? How do you collect from different places that will give you the same volumes every day? It changes. It's very fickle, and hence it's very difficult to build an effective business model without scale, right? So I think there's a lot to be said about startups with technologies to transform food waste, but partnering up with bigger companies that have the reach, access to large volumes of waste, hopefully consistent. If not consistent, at least there's something they can do to consolidate a little bit better, to process and treat the waste a little bit better. So it's not an easy, straightforward business.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it. But just as we wrap up, Jolene, I mean, I'd love to just understand how excited you are about the future of food on this World Food Day.
Well, that's exciting. I think, on my travels and in my work, I've seen so much activity in this space. I'm really excited about how excited young people are getting. Increasingly, and I say this on many platforms as well, I try to be careful, but the food industry has been the same for a long time. And now that, this awareness and sustainability and these options are available to people, and more interesting jobs are being created in food, right? In AI, in automation, in computing, and manufacturing 2.0, 4.0 now, and biotechnology. I think young people are getting excited to take charge of what food can look like in the future. And there's a certain vein of saying, how do we work with people who've been doing this for years and years and years to envision a different future? Because right now, the system doesn't change if there are no incentives for it to change. So yeah, I think what's most exciting to me is that young people are starting to wake up to this and actively seeking careers in food. Because for a long time, it wasn't sexy to be working in agriculture, right? Our grandparents worked in agriculture so that we didn't have to. But now I think there's an opportunity for that to change.
Yeah. Young people like you, Jolene.
Yes.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We've been speaking with Jolene Lum, Head of Business Development at Nurasa. You've given us a lot of food for thought there.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. This was
thank
really
you for
fun.
celebrating World Food Day with us on Causeway Conversations with myself, Rianne Lovell-Boland.
And Freda Liu.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Rianne. Thank you, Freda.